My father, Hinton Brown, was born in Durban, South Africa in 1922. When he was in his final year of school, war broke out, the Second World War broke out, and recruiters were sent around to the schools to sign up young men, all of whom were very willing to join up. And he made application for the South African Air Force, and you have to remember that all the South Africans were volunteers. They were excited to be part of what they thought would be an adventure with the opportunity to travel and see the world. So he was very pleased to find out that he had been selected to join the Air Force, which was his first choice. And he, after he had turned 18 in 1940, he found himself on his way to being trained as a pilot. After going through all the necessary courses, he was eventually sent up to Egypt and North Africa, and at the beginning of 1944 was sent to join number 1 Fighter Squadron, who at that stage were based in Trenta. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had become less of a threat by that stage. They didn't have many aircraft in the air, and very few German airplanes were seen during the day. And the squadron's task then turned towards strafing and bombing. So they were strafing and bombing trains and vehicles, and supporting the Allies with their push up north, pushing the Germans back north. They adapted the airplanes to carry 50-pound bombs, which they used generally in support of the ground forces. My father did not speak much about the war, and all the people that I met, all his friends that I met, and anyone that had fought in the war never really did. But he did keep a diary, and it's from this diary that I now tell his story. It was on the 3rd of July 1944 that he was returning to their base in Orvieto. They took off from Orvieto, and they were on their way back after an uneventful fighter sweep over airfields northeast of Florence. And they ran into very, very heavy 88mm anti-aircraft fire. He was laughing to himself. He was having a chuckle when the leader of that sweep, Colonel Bosman, came over the intercom and saying, "What have these guys done to me?" He seemed to be catching a lot of the flak and a lot of the aircraft fire. And the next minute, my father heard a noise, and he smelled the cordite, and his oil pressure dropped, and the engine revolutions screamed up. So he realized he'd been hit, and he radioed through that he had been to the other people flying with him in the mission, and he told them he was having to bail out now. So when he tried to bail out, you have to roll the aeroplane onto your back, and then you get ejected like that. You fall out. He found that his parachute had got trapped in the perspex hood, and he had his legs half in the airplane, and his airplane was heading down, nose down, into a death dive, and he was trapped. But he'd heard about a person in a similar position who had kicked the spade control, the control of the airplane, and he with his feet he managed to kick this control forward, which had the effect of lifting the nose of the airplane, and he popped out. He activated his parachute and was floating down, and he remembers that it was it was really, really silent from the noise that he had been in his aircraft. It was now totally silent, and he was floating down. His airplane did a loop, half loop, underneath him and crashed into the side of the mountain. And he started now hearing voices and dogs barking as he drifted slowly downwards. And the problem for him at that stage was he was heading towards a valley, and valleys meant that there were roads, and roads meant that there were Germans that could have got there very quickly. So he tried pulling on the strings on either side of his parachute, and he found that his legs started swaying side to side as he tried to control, his landing further up a hill away from the roads. And he was swinging from side to side as he hit the ground, and all of a sudden had a very sharp pain in his foot. So he landed very hard on the side of a hill just outside the town of Sant Agatha Feltria, and an elderly man came out of the bush and led him. He unhitched his parachute, and this elderly man came, led him up a hill, and he was staggering quite badly because his foot was injured. They reached a house. He was given a glass of wine there, and he was told to suck some eggs, 2 eggs raw. He had 2 raw eggs. And then the elderly man led him further up the hillside, and after a few minutes, a couple of men jumped out of the bush, and they had red scarves around their necks, and the partisans had found him now. They were dressed in civilian clothes, and the red scarves indicated that they were partisans. After about an hour of battling up the hill, they were helping him up the hill there on his injured foot. A whole little band of other partisans had joined them in the meantime, and he really was struggling with his foot. So they went ahead. Some of the partisans went ahead. They got a donkey, and they put him on a donkey, and he completed the rest of that trip on the back of a donkey. He eventually arrived at a village where he was given a lunch. The owner of the house asked if he'd wanted to stay with him or go on with the partisans. He thought he was too close to the crash site, so he chose the partisans. And they took him to the village of Rivelpau, where there was a doctor who turned out later to be a third-year medical student, had a look at his foot. That night, he slept in a loft above the schoolroom in a bed that a very attractive young lady, he said, gave up for him. The schoolroom was next door to a tavern, and there was a lot of coming and going from there, a lot of noise. So his first night was spent very, very, very unhappy, being disturbed by the noises of people coming and going, and thoughts of his family back home. None of his fellow pilots had seen him bail out, so none of them had seen him leave his aircraft. So they went back and reported that he was missing, believed killed, and that news was sent back to his family. His friend, who he shared a tent with, had also had to bail in the same area on the same day, but he had been shot dead by the fascists as he was parachuting down. So, such is the fate of war, that he was very lucky to be on the ground now and away from the Germans who were chasing him, and being helped by the partisans. So on the third day, the doctor told him he was being taken to stay with a civilian family. So he changed his Air Force uniform for civilian clothes. So once he had done that, he'd given up the right to be treated as a prisoner of war, and he could be shot as a spy if he was ever caught. They travelled for about 3 hours to Montriolo, where he was given lunch at the church, and he had a wash and a shave before going on to the house where he was to stay. Everyone in the village he arrived at were very friendly, and they were all curious to see him, but he was worried about this kind of celebrity status that he had, and wondered how long it would be before he was betrayed. So around lunchtime the next day, 2 Englishmen arrived at the village. They were George Day and Bob Wilders. So they had been captured at Tobruk and had been on the run for about 11 months after escaping from a prisoner of war camp. So both at this stage could speak very good Italian, and the problem of communication now was resolved with them being able to communicate. The 2 of them had been waiting at the town of Donacilio for events to develop as the front line was approaching. So they were waiting there for the Allies to push the Germans back, and then they would be able to rejoin the Allies. They invited him to stay with them, which was very risky for them, as the Germans were searching the area for a blonde pilot. Someone had told the Germans that my father had blonde hair and he was walking with a limp. So the Germans were now looking for a blonde pilot who limped. The Germans were busy barricading themselves behind the Gothic line and clearing the area of any possible threat. And there were serious stories of brutality. The Germans were just wiping out villages and killing people, and creating a real kind of situation of terror that would basically try and stop people from helping fugitives like my father and his 2 friends. The presence of the invaders brought mortal dangers to those who helped their enemy. They and their families faced execution by the Germans on the spot, immediately. So if they were caught helping my father and his 2 fellow soldiers, they would have been executed. So they were extremely brave and very kind people to be offering help, shelter, and food under those kind of circumstances. My father was then taken to meet the padre. His name was Don Francesco Barbini, and he was going to stay in his house. Now, Wilders, the 2 Englishmen, Wilders was staying with the padre, and Day was staying with a family in the village of Donacilio. And the padre was very, very good to them, a very good man, and my father felt very comfortable staying there with him. His foot by this stage was feeling better, and with the aid of a stick he could hobble about a bit. The Allied advance had slowed, and they had now decided not to wait for the front line to catch up with them, but to start walking towards it. Then on Monday the 10th of July, news was received that the Germans had raided the house where he had stayed with the doctor a few nights before. The doctor had been taken, and the Germans could well be on their trail. My father was worried that he had given his flying jacket to the doctor, and they might know that he had helped them. Don Francesco's mother was very worried. The village she stayed at was full of Germans. All the Germans were there, and in a place called Alfaro, and she and her 1 daughter Agata was looking after the Germans there, while Don Francesco's other sister Agnes was helping to look after the English in the village of Donacilio. The Germans had taken provisions from another village nearby, and a day later, so they were very worried that things were everything was getting a bit close to Don Attilio, and that Don Attilio would be the next village raided. And the padre told my father to stay indoors and not be seen. So it was very, very tense situation that was developing there with news of the Germans getting closer and closer to Don Attilio. So all three of the Vedas decided that night that they should stay in a shelter that they and Wilders had built. They built a capano in the forest, and in case the village was raided, they could be safe up there. And they'd go up there and stay. And if everything was all right, then Don Francesco was going to ring extra couple of rings on the church bell. And when they received the extra 3 rings, the next day they came down and had their lunch in the village, and also at the church. It was then decided that my father should sleep at the church that night. They felt that his foot wasn't really up to climbing the distance and the height to the capano, and my father wasn't happy with that. He really thought he should get out, but he ended up not sleeping between the sheets that night. So if anyone came, he could get away quickly, and no one could see. It wouldn't look as though he had been. It wouldn't look as if the bed had been slept in. Early the next morning, Don Francesco came running into his room and told him the Germans were coming, and he was to leave the house. Don Francesco had been alerted by an old man, a charcoal maker, who had heard his dog barking when he saw a group of men walking past. It was heading in the direction of Don Attilio. So he took a shortcut and arrived at the church before them and managed to alert Don Francesco. It later transpired that a woman spy had given him away, describing him as the blonde who limped. The 2 Germans and about 10 fascists had set off from a nearby village at 9 p.m. the night before, the evening before that, meaning to arrive at the village around 1 o'clock, where they would have surprised them all sleeping in bed. They took a wrong turn and had to retrace their steps. The man who alerted Don Francesco tried to tell him to run and hide with my father, but he said he had done nothing that a good Christian would not have done, and he went to ring the bell for the 7 a.m. Mass. The fascists thought he was trying to get his parishioners to come to his aid, and were angry when they met him. But Don Francesco, being a priest, had said, "Look, I would help anyone in trouble," and he said even if it was a German. But when the Germans searched the house, the fascists searched the house, they raided the church, and they arrested Don Francesco and another partisan, Mario Romeo, who had been helping the invaders. They had searched all over, but couldn't find my father. The Germans said that they should release Don Francesco, but the fascists insisted on taking him. Now, after hiding out in the bush for the whole day, my father was helped to the shelter by 2 girls who had brought him food and water. There he found his 2 English friends, and they weren't keen at all on staying further and hanging around the blonde who limped. And Day said that he would stay and wait for Don Francesco to return, and then he would leave. And Wilders said that he was going to go the next day, and my father would again be on his own. They didn't want to be anywhere near him. He was attracting too much attention. And Wilders said that he was going to head south towards the Allies, and he'd be heading off the next day. he was obviously nervous, my father, and as he would now be on his own, he wasn't able to walk properly, and he couldn't speak Italian. So he was extremely worried about how he was going to go forward with that, particularly with the village having been raided now and Don Francesco taken away. When he woke up the next morning, Wilders had not left, and they agreed that they should rather stick together, and the two of them slept the night in the Capano that evening, woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and then started heading south. Now, because of my father's blonde hair, and he had a blonde hair, moustache, and beard, they got soot from the fire, and they rubbed it into his hair and his moustache, and they set off in disguise like that. Don Francesco and Mario Romeo were both taken to Sarsina, and then from there to a prison in Forli, where unfortunately, after a German had been found, a German officer had been found shot dead, they pulled 10 people out of the prison, and Don Francesco and Mario Romeo were two of those pulled out. 2 out of the 10 pulled out in retribution for the killing of this German. And that was a rule then. If anyone did kill a German, they would execute 10 of the local population. So after Wilders and my father started heading southwards towards the south, they continued to try and walk out of sight. The Gothic line was being constructed, and they had to walk through, between sentry posts. They were busy building the Gothic line at that stage, so they would see people, the soldiers and the people recruited to build the line, the builders, along the way, and they had to try and avoid the attention. My father was, he'd kept his, he had a water bottle in his survival kit that he'd taken from when he'd left his aeroplane. So he had this bottle which he kept under a coat that he was wearing. And the one story he in his book was, or in the notes that he made, was that they got stopped by a German, and obviously pretending to be Italians. Wilders could speak the language, and then they pointed at my father and said, "Is that a gun you got underneath there?" And my father said, "No, fortunately they didn't ask him to open it up and see, but that was a very, very close escape that they had along the way." They needed food and shelter as they went, obviously, and people were very, very scared and reluctant to even let them in their houses or even be seen talking to them. So there were kind people that did allow them to stay, but generally in the barn. They would say there's a barn out there, and got quite cold at night. So they would be kept in a barn, and they would be given food, by some of the peasant farmers along the way. And then after a couple of days, farmer that they bumped into said that there was an Englishman that had come down, had been shot down fairly recently, and he was staying in a house. They said he was a South American, and my father knew, well, there weren't South Americans fighting in the war. It was more likely a South African, and they headed off to go and meet this man. Now they were telling everyone that my father was a soldier and wasn't an airman, because that obviously, if they'd mentioned an airman, that could have got out, and they were in danger of the fascists, hearing that there was an airman in the area. So he was pretending to be a soldier, and eventually they brought him to the house where they were keeping this South American, which turned out to be a South African, and in fact, one of my father's friends. And with a whole lot of, in view of a lot of people, these two met up, and my father had to tell him in English, please don't give me away as a pilot. So they had to pretend that they knew each other from when they were back in South Africa, and that they were very friendly, and they embraced each other and hugged, and he was very happy to now have someone that he knew from back home. For about 2 weeks, it would have been about 10 days, 2 weeks, they spent wandering near the Gothic line and heading towards the front line, which was obviously a little bit south of the Gothic line. They had to avoid many Germans. The whole area was full of Germans and people building the Gothic line, and the Germans coming back to build their defenses. And they were told at that stage that it wouldn't be long before the Germans withdrew to the Gothic line. But they were worried that it would take too long for the advancing allies to catch up with them. So they made the decision to head across and walk to the Allied lines. During the time behind the lines, they were obviously dressed up like farmers, and they had to do work like they did a lot of harvesting, wheat harvesting. While behind the lines, they had to be very, very aware of traitors, people that would report them as fugitives and the enemy of the Germans and the fascists. So it was a very, very kind of nervous time for them, trying to find their way back. They slept out in the open. Sometimes they were fed food by farmers who'd bring them food to the haystacks that they stayed in. And on some of the doors, where they knocked looking for food, the women would be very, very scared to help him at all. After meeting up with Tony Bristol, they were invited to go and stay with people called the Batties. The Batties owned a restaurant in San Sepulcro, and were now hiding out in the hills while there was a battle going on. So the Germans were defending San Sepulcro, and the Allies were coming now to try and flush them out. So all the citizens of San Sepulcro had gone to hide out in the hills alongside that, and my father ended up staying at a place called Germagno with the Batties and with Tony Bristol, where he said they were looked after really well. The partisans really wanted my father and his friends to stay, so that when the Allies did advance, they could tell them how good they had been to help my father and his friends. But my father was keen to head back and try and get to the lines. The partisans were also wary of a farmer. There was a farmer there that was saying, look, he'd be able to lead them through the lines. His farmhouse was right where a German post was, so he was able to lead them through the front line. And after waiting in that area for about 3 or 4 days, wilders who my father had left Donatello with, eventually left a note to them. He disappeared and left a note to my father to say that they'd got an opportunity to be taken across, and the farmer would come back for them in a couple of days if everything had gone well. And that in fact did happen. The farmer came back with a note from the British Army's leaders there, and saying, look, just wait there, we'll soon be through. But they didn't want to wait. The farmer said, I will take you through if you want me to, and of course they did say fine. There were 3 of them, Tony Bristol, a man called Cliff Andrew, who they'd also met along the way. He'd also escaped and was on the run. So the 3 of them decided to go with the farmer. Early one morning, they headed off, and to get through the lines, they had to go through the German defensive line. They walked straight through German posts with the guns on either side. My father was carrying a bucket of water, and they had a dog, and they were pretending to be farmers farming the area. They weren't able to go around, because if they'd gone around, anyone who looked suspicious would have been shot at. So they shot and killed. So they ended up going straight through the German defenses, waving at them as they went. And the farmer said, we're nearly there. And the English, they went through the defensive lines of the Germans. The farmer said, we're nearly there. All that lies in between us and the English now is a minefield. So they had to walk through this minefield. My father said he took great care to put his feet where the man in front of him was. And they managed to get through. Yeah, they arrived on the other side looking like Italian farmers, and they walked up to one of the soldiers in a jeep. He was an officer, and they said, please take us to, we are escapees. We've escaped from behind the lines now, behind the German lines, and please will you take us to your headquarters? They didn't believe him. And anyway, after a lot of persuasion, they said, okay, you can climb in, we'll take you. And they drove towards the command center, and that's where they ended their journey.
And please thank those people who helped me survive when I was shot down. Please thank them very much indeed. Thank you. And I have never forgotten them.